Hello, hello. We're in our newly equipped Cameron Williams Auditorium. So we've got a new podium. You can now see people behind the podium since it's a more reasonably sized, but I'm glad everybody here. This is our department's fall celebration. The Shirley Phillips Distinguished Lecture in No-Till Agriculture. This is the 28th year of this lecture. Shirley gave the first one 28 years ago. So Kentucky's had a long history of no-till agriculture. It's considered the birthplace of no-tillage agriculture in southern Kentucky. There's a marker where the first no-till corn fields were planted in southern Kentucky on the farm of Harry and Lawrence Young. And Shirley Phillips was instrumental in working and developing the system through the University of Kentucky. Here in the department, we have a long history of working on no-tillage agriculture. The Blevins Grove, I had to add John's name into this long-term tillage study because he's probably been conducting it longer than Bob Blevins was. The Blevins Grove long-term no-tillage study started in 1970, so this is the 48th year of continuous annual tillage versus no-tillage management. It started in the 50-plus-year-old grass sod when no-tillage started. A lot of it went into sod. Most no-tillage now is just in the rotational farming. The cropping system here is continuous corn with a cereal cover crop. And we're hoping in 2 more years we're going to have a grand celebration and a large scientific response to what happens after 50 years of no-tillage. But after 10 years of no-tillage, the scientists in our department, were a featured article in Science magazine, Science journal, no-tillage agriculture. And that was a no-tillage cornfield in central Kentucky, planted into sod. Just to let you know, we do have a no-tillage corn that looks a little better than that these days, and it's a prominent place in the agriculture in Kentucky and in the United States. It's also big in South America. We had a celebration 4 years ago when a group of Brazilian farmers came to the University of Kentucky to present in honor of Shirley Phillips, a bust of Shirley Phillips, his contribution to no-till agriculture in Brazil, big in Brazil and Argentina also as a soil conservation method. Okay, so this 28th Shirley Phillips Distinguished Lecture in No-Till Agriculture will be presented by Dr. Eileen Kladivko, and John Grove will introduce our speaker.
I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank Todd for, without my permission, including my name in that title for the long-term no-till plots that I gratefully maintain for the department and those who would otherwise get data from them. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Eileen Kladivko. Eileen is a full professor of agronomy in the Department of Agronomy at Purdue University. She has formal responsibilities in research, instruction, and extension, the classical 3-way split that most faculty deplore, particularly early in their career. Eileen got her bachelor's in environmental science, MS in agronomy, and both of those came from Purdue. And then she went to the University of Wisconsin and finished up in 1982 under Dr. Dennis Keeney, who at that time was one of the foremost nitrogen research folks in the land. She started her career pretty quickly after getting her PhD in 1982, starting at Purdue, and has been there ever since. Generally, her responsibility fall with teaching and research in kind of three areas: soil physics, soil biology, and soil management. Eileen describes herself as an applied soil physicist. Her specific research focus is to identify soil management systems that seek to improve environmental health, quality, and promote ag sustainability. She's worked in the areas of tile drainage on crop yields and nitrate losses to surface waters, the interactions of earthworms, soil management, and various soil physical properties, conservation, tillage, and cover crops for soil quality improvement, and the preferential flow of chemical materials through the soil. She's well recognized in our profession, and this has culminated in Eileen being named a fellow of the Soil Science Society of America. One of the things that Eileen has done a lot with, and I think is also one of the major contributing factors that the group of us who nominated Eileen to come today, was the fact that she's been heavily involved in cover crop research. And that investment has been fairly long-standing. What Todd saw as a kind of a beautiful corn picture there had no cover crop between the rows. And I actually like the science one, and in the long-term plots, we maintain an active winter cereal cover crop as what we consider to be a part and a parcel of the no-till system. Eileen is a co-founder of the Midwest Cover Crop Council and has been an active member on the executive committee for that group. She is Purdue's representative to the Indiana Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative, which is a joint effort by Purdue, NRCS, the Indiana Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and the Indiana State Department of Ag to try to educate farmers, conservation agency staff, and crop advisors about no-till cover crops and nutrient management for these combined systems. And she serves on the leadership team. She's also, and I find this also an important thing, she's active on two large multi-state projects. The Corn Systems Coordinated Ag Project, which is called CS-CAP. It's a CAP project that was funded. She's a co-lead in this one to try to improve the resilience of corn-based cropping systems to climate stress. By the way, in case you would like to know, this will probably be one of the emphasis for the new Corn and Forage Center of Excellence at Princeton. She also serves on the second one called the Transforming Drainage Project, which being a native of Michigan, I find interesting because in Michigan there's only two kinds of soils, too wet and too dry. You put drain tile in the first one and you put a center pivot over the other one. You know, there's no happy medium. So transforming drainage could be interesting. But she aims to redesign, or the project aims to redesign ag drainage systems to better optimize drainage, but water reuse and water quality in Midwestern landscapes. So one of the reasons that Eileen has been asked to be here is this wide range of contributions that she's made in support of conservation tillage, and in particular no-till ag. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce Eileen today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, these lights here maybe could be.
That's good enough? Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for being here. I'm certainly honored and humbled to have the invitation to present the Shirley Phillips Memorial No-Till Lecture. I don't think I ever actually met Shirley, but as a young assistant professor at Purdue in the early 1980s, working with Jerry Mannering and Don Griffith on no-till, I certainly learned about Shirley's contributions to no-till and all the pioneering work he had done. I knew more of his other colleagues that were mentioned in that science article, Ron Phillips and Bob Blevins, and certainly Grant Thomas and Wilbur Fry. I knew quite a bit, had quite a bit of interaction with them. So Kentucky certainly had a rich history of work in cover crops and no-till, and I'm really happy to be here. So I did take the opportunity, doing my good homework, of course, to to learn just a little bit more about Shirley Phillips in preparation for this talk. And there's a couple of things that I got out of the UK Hall of Distinguished Alumni website, that there was a couple things that I'm going to refer to in my talk just a little bit. But his initial no-till work was very importantly done with a farmer and a county extension agent. And so I think that's a very important part of a lot of the work that we all do, is in collaboration with others and not just other researchers, right? But county agents and farmers. And until that farmer, Harry Young, planted a no-till cover crop, Shirley, as I understand, was very much into making sure you have good seed bed preparation and all that kind of good stuff. But once Harry planted this cover crop, this cash crop in no-till, and it worked out pretty good for the first year, he became an advocate of this new system and was convinced that it had a lot of promise, and he was going to put a lot of effort into doing that, and then convinced many of his colleagues here at the university to work on it as well. So building networks, encouraging others to improve a system that shows promise, and basically working to improve the system, as opposed to what sometimes happens is proving that a system won't work, right? Whoa, this has got promise, let's work to make and improve that system. So John's already mentioned actually these three groups, but I also want to kind of acknowledge the great importance that these networks and collaborations have made to me, especially in the last 10 years, the Midwest Cover Crops Council, the Indiana Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative, and the Corn Systems and Climate CAP. So I won't go into any more detail because John's basically already kind of talked about those groups. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to focus mostly on cover crops, but kind of within a no-till system for the most part. So why are we talking about cover crops? Certainly it's because there are many potential benefits from cover crops for water quality, for crop productivity, and for soil health. So if it's such a great system, or can be such a great system, why aren't cover crops used by everyone yet? And of course, you all know at least many of the answers. There are in fact some risks and challenges to integrating cover crops into an annual cropping system. There is a learning curve, which I re-emphasize to all of my colleagues who sometimes get super excited about something and forget to tell people about the whole picture and the challenges and the learning curve that's involved. Farmers, of course, have real-time constraints in the fall and in the spring when you would need to be dealing with cover crops. There are real costs, and in many cases, there's no short-term economic gain. There might be one long-term, but not short-term. So those are some of the reasons that we don't have 100% adoption of cover crops across the Midwest. I'd like to start with talking about what's the rationale for using cover crops in the first place. That's basically to have a living and growing plant at times of the year that we typically don't have a living and growing plant in our summer annual cropping systems. So again, in Indiana and Ohio, I mean, we're talking corn, soybeans. So have something growing when we typically don't. So it can be capturing sunlight, photosynthesizing, feeding exudates to feed those soil organisms, trapping and recycling nutrients, and basically just making better use of the time and resources that we have available to grow something and to do something good for the soil. If you want to think about it in a photo way instead, this was at the Purdue Agronomy Farm a few years ago. It happened to be a particularly early harvest year, but this was early September, and the soybean and corn plots there had already been harvested. So those plots were brown all September, October, November, half of December, maybe white in the middle of the winter, brown in March, brown in April. The grass strip, okay, it wasn't a cover crop, just the grass strip at, an alleyway in between the plots, green and growing, photosynthesizing, exuding carbon, feeding organisms, trapping nutrients, all September, October, November, half of December, green again in March, April. So basically what we're trying to do is shrink that brown gap and expand that green growing period in our summer annual cropping systems. I do emphasize whenever I'm speaking, whether it's with researchers or extension folks or NRCS or farmers, that cover crops are part of a system. There are different potential benefits and different challenges to each cover crop. So there's no one cover crop and one recipe. Folks need to adapt their cropping system. That might include changing their fertilizer management, their tillage or no tillage management, their pest management, to that cover crop. The thing that makes me shiver is when someone says, oh, I'm just going to go out, or I just did. I just went out and threw all this cover crop seed on, and now I'm not going to do anything different. I've got, I just put the seed on there and everything should be fine, right? Ooh, well, maybe not. Okay, so there is a real learning curve, and I really emphasize that also with fellow researchers, because each researcher has a learning curve too. And so we all need to, when we do something new, try to learn as much as we can from people who have already done it, so that we don't do the same mistakes that everybody tends to do when they first start. So I really emphasize to my colleagues, whether they're agency staff or researchers, that it's not a good thing for us to just talk about the benefits of cover crops without also talking about what are the challenges and what are the management strategies that you can use to deal with those challenges. So what I want to do today is talk just a little bit about why we're interested in cover crops, a little bit more, talk about some of the potential benefits, which many of you know. I'm just going to highlight a few. Just look a little bit at adoption trends, and then talk a bit about details being very important, and then some strategic needs. So one of the questions that I sometimes get, and I'm sure a few of you do, is aren't cover crops kind of old school? I mean, we used to do that a long time ago, but we don't need to do that in our modern cropping systems, do we? So it is true that cover crops were a basic source of fertility pre-commercial fertilizer. And it is also true that the miracles of chemistry and genetics and large machinery that started really en masse in the 60s reduced the apparent need for things like cover crops. We replaced the need for cover crops for fertility with fertilizer coming in a bag. By having genetics and big machinery and more fertilizer, it masked the deterioration that started to occur in our soil physical and biological conditions. Also, the loss of small mixed farms, at least in the main part of the Corn Belt. Kentucky may still have a little bit more of that than we do in Indiana, but certainly the loss of mixed farms, basically we lost the incentive to grow a rotation with a pasture or a hay crop. So my answer is, yeah, cover crops might have been old school, but we're not talking about old school cover crops. We're talking about new school cover crops. So soil health, the modern version of that is we have seen a big renewed interest in attention being paid to soil health as a key to sustainable crop production. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, nationally has certainly made a big push that way. And in Indiana, our NRCS, state NRCS, has been hugely supportive and pushing the whole concept of soil health, really has been a leader in that area. Improved soil health is needed to harness the full power of all those other improvements that we make, like genetics and like chemistry, in order to take full advantage of that. We're looking at soil health as a way to improve resilience to climate stresses. And I'm talking mainly about cover crops today, but certainly those are just one tool in the toolbox. We're not saying cover crops is a panacea that solves all of our problems. There is no such thing. I like a couple of the slides. NRCS has a very large website, web presence now in the whole area of soil health. We could debate for hours about the definition of soil health. I don't care to do that, but I think this particular slide and definition of soil health is a pretty good one. The capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants and animals and humans. If you're not aware of the NRCS site, check it out, Unlock the Secrets of the Soil. They have a lot of good stuff on there. In Indiana, we have used this slide quite a bit, again from NRCS. 4 main principles of improving soil health, which include both no-till and cover crops. So minimizing disturbance, that's your no-till, maximizing soil cover, that would be no-till as well as cover crops, maximizing biodiversity, and providing continuous living roots. So basically always trying to cover the soil and feed the soil as much as possible. So the cover crops in the modern version, okay, not the old school, the differences that I would see at least are these. First of all, we're trying to integrate those cover crops into our modern high-yielding corn soybean systems in the Midwest. the timing is different, the species are different, the varieties and the crop management practices are different than what they were 50 years ago. So we're looking at taking some old knowledge of cover crops, but bringing it into our modern corn soybean systems. Many farmers have never planted, at least in Indiana and Ohio and Illinois, have never planted cover crops, nor did their parents. If grandpa had cover crops, they were quite different because of the timing and the whole cropping system. Many of our farmers, as opposed to, I think Kentucky, you still have more forage experience, but many of our farmers in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois also don't grow forages, right? So never planted a cover crop, never grown a forage. A cover crop is kind of a new thing, right? They don't really know how to do it. So to me, that's a great opportunity, right? Every challenge is an opportunity. So we've got an opportunity for all kinds of research to integrate these cover crops into our modern systems. And we have a tremendous need for education about how to integrate those cover crops successfully into our current systems. What are the potential benefits? There's a long list of potential benefits. I'm not going to go through all of those. I am going to talk a little bit about the ones highlighted in red there: nitrogen scavenger, reducing erosion, and improving soil health. But again, I was asked by the graduate students this morning about which is the best cover crop for Indiana. And my answer was, well, it depends. Right? It depends on your goal. It depends on exactly what you're trying to do. And I keep emphasizing that when we talk to farmers. What are the main purposes that you have for growing a cover crop? Then we can talk about which cover crops and how to manage them. Okay, so which are the cover crops that are typically being used in the Eastern Corn Belt right now? Of course, grasses are probably still the most common because they're the most widely adaptable and can be planted the latest. So oats and cereal rye and annual ryegrass are some of the more common ones that are used in Indiana, Ohio, and West. Brassicas are a little bit newer as far as cover crop use, and the daikon radish here is a very popular cover crop. It can break up shallow compacted layers, the tuber, but the taproot that's below that, a couple of feet, is actually, I think, of more significance for improving soil health than is the tuber itself. Brassicas would also include rapeseed and turnip and other similar crops. So not as common. They need to be planted earlier, but nonetheless coming on. And then, of course, legumes, the ones that are being grown right now, include crimson clover and Austrian winter pea and hairy vetch, of course, red clover still, and there are other legumes as well. But those would be the most common throughout the Eastern Corn Belt. The classic purpose of cover crops, of course, is to cover the soil to reduce erosion by water or wind. My colleague Tom Casper out at the USDA lab in Ames, Iowa, did some more recent work again on erosion with cover crops. Of course, that had been done decades ago, but kind of doing some additional work. And on the left there, he's got no cover crop, did simulated rainfall in the spring, quite a bit of erosion. You can see down to the wheel track there. In the middle, he was oat cover, which of course winter killed. And then he did the erosion study in the spring, and it cut the erosion about in half compared to the no cover crop. And then on the right is the cereal rye cover, green and starting to grow again in early spring, and that cut the erosion even further. So bottom line here is that cover crops will reduce erosion, whether dead or alive, but more so if they're alive. Okay, now did you catch that very generalization that I just said? Cover crops will reduce erosion unless they're a radish planted by itself, okay? So this, I just want to use this as an illustration of details being extremely important. So this was one of our local farmers who planted radishes, had great radish growth in the fall. This was planted after wheat, so he had a lot of time for the radishes to grow. Put on manure, planted radishes. And then this is in mid-March, and you can see there, if I am successful in doing, there we go. You can see here half of the radish tuber. It's kind of like freeze-dried, sticking out of the soil. And then you can just see all this network of dead leaves that's kind of covering the soil surface. So the soil surface is actually pretty well covered at that moment. But within 2 weeks, everything was gone, right? So the soil started warming up. The biology ate that stuff up tremendously because it's highly degradable. And then the soil was bare. So the point is that radishes by themselves are not something that we recommend at all anymore because they make the soil more prone to erosion. They basically leave it bare too early. So we always recommend that radishes be mixed with something else, usually a grass, so that at least some of those nutrients can be taken up and that we maintain some amount of soil surface cover. You've seen this slide before. All I've done here is add a little bit to say that tile drain studies in the Midwest, mine included, Tom Casper's included, many, Dan Jane's, others, have consistently shown that if you get a good cover crop growth, you will reduce nitrate leaching to tile drains, usually on the order of about half. Okay, so a very significant reduction because those cover crops are scavenging the nitrogen, taking it up, basically tying it up into their biomass. How important can this be? Well, I think it can be quite important. This was a study that I did with these guys out at the USDA lab in Ames, where we basically did an analysis of 5 Midwestern states that have a lot of tile drainage. And we looked at a couple of counties in each of those states, and we decided where we thought it would be relatively easy to adopt cover crops. And we could debate all day about whether you agree with our assessment or not, but basically based on cropping system and tillage system that they were currently using, we said which acres we thought could relatively easily adopt cover crops. Rob Malone ran the root zone water quality model, looked at nitrate uptake, and we found that basically with what I would consider fairly conservative estimates, wherever we had to kind of draw the line, we found a nearly 20% reduction in nitrate load going down the Mississippi River just from this one practice out of the 45% goal. So we're basically taking care of half of the goal with a fairly modest assumption about cover crop adoption and cover crop growth by this one practice alone. So again, I'm a big advocate of cover crops being a huge potential way of improving the soil, but also taking care of a lot of our nitrate leaching issues. This picture, again, is a picture worth 1,000 words. On the right, corn silage ground in the early spring in Iowa, crusted, eroding, nutrients leaching away, organisms not being fed fresh material. On the left, cereal rye, feeding those organisms, recycling nutrients, protecting the soil surface. As we talk with landowners, this is the kind of thing that we need to kind of get imparted to them. The long-term long-term worth of their land can be greatly affected by whether you let it erode or whether you provide more cover. Just one piece of data here from my recent master's student, Joe Rorick, on water stable aggregation, a wet sieving type method on a field that had cover crop, cereal rye cover crops for 4 years. And you can see in the, so we have mean weight diameter in millimeters, the top 2 depths, 0 to 10 centimeter and 10 to 20 centimeters, where we had cereal rye, whether into corn stalks or into soybean stubble, we had improved aggregate stability compared to where we did not. So that was the case in the top 2 depths. At the bottom 2 depths, we did not yet have any impact on aggregate stability, but where we really need it is near the surface anyway. So we would anticipate potentially with time those deeper depths might see an improvement, but what we really are looking for is near the surface for the most part anyway. So this is a great picture of one of my students when we were out sampling some of the cover crop on this farmer's field, and at that point we were just kind of pulling up some tubers to get some idea of their content, and in this case a couple of feet of the taproot came with it. And so again, when I'm talking with farmers, I say, well, the state fair radish might be the biggest diameter, longest radish. If you go to a farmer meeting, that's always a picture. Giant radish, state fair radish. But to me, the taproot is much more important for improving the soil permeability and rooting than is the tuber itself. This is actually from my earthworm counting days. This is a subsoil, a no-till field where you can see the cast material of the nightcrawler, the deep burrowing earthworm in the background, and the corn root proliferating in that channel. But again, the point is, which channel came first? Did the nightcrawler channel come and then the corn roots grow in it, and then the cover crop roots and then the corn roots? You know, basically these channels get used and reused and reused and probably can deepen because the root is able to penetrate a certain distance without too much hard work. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about details. Details are very important. I personally don't really like details, but I'm forced to deal with it. So not all cover crops work equally well for different purposes. So you've got to select the right cover crop, and then you've got to figure out how you're going to manage it. And the same cover crop can be managed in different ways depending on what your purpose is. So how do we go about selecting cover crops? When I'm talking with farmers, or I'm talking with crop advisors, I suggest these questions to kind of get started. First of all, what is your main purpose? Why do you want to grow a cover crop? Besides the fact that I said it was a good thing, that's not good enough, okay? Why do you want to plant a cover crop? What's your cropping and tillage system, your current cash crop, your tillage or no tillage system? What time windows do you have available? How are you going to seed it? How are you going to terminate it? When are you going to terminate it? And then a whole host of very specific questions. So the questions that are highlighted in green here are ones that are Midwest cover crops, MCCC. We have a selector tool, and it can help folks with those kinds of questions. And I think I have one slide. Yes, just one slide to very briefly show that we have a selector tool for the Corn Belt, the 12 states in the North Central region. Sorry, Kentucky's not there, but you're going to have your own with your Southeast Regional Cover Crops Council soon. And we basically have, you put in your state and your county, and it pulls up the 30-year frost date information. And then this tells you in the green bars here, it tells you when you have reliable establishment in your county of these particular cover crops. You can select, I'm not going to show you that screen here, but you can select the purpose that you have for the cover crop. Is it a nitrogen scavenger? Is it an erosion, fighting erosion? Is it a legume, and so on? And it will rank those cover crops and allow you to pick cover crops that would meet your needs. Again, this is a good start for people who don't know very much about cover crops. It's very, very easy to use, and it gives you those planting dates for your particular county. John asked me a little bit about tillage trends in Indiana, and so I just put in a couple slides for you, John, to talk about no-till acreage in Indiana. You can see here, if we look at the bottom graph, that the red line here, no-till soybeans, this is from 1990 till about now. No-till soybeans have been up there in that 60 to 70% range for quite a while. Very, very common practice. No-till corn, the blue line, is more down here in the 20 to 25% range. In spite of all the good scientific work that we have that shows that it's comparable, it's still not common. So the green line, since we're about half corn, half soybeans, overall we're about 40% adoption. This map up here is actually not current adoption, it's the percent increase. And so in central Indiana, over the last 25 years, we've had more of a growth. In southern Indiana, we had the growth very early. And this is actually showing 2017 no-till soybeans. And you can see a lot of no-till in southern Indiana, awful lot like Kentucky. Okay, so the terrain is one of the big things that makes a difference in Indiana adoption, right? If you're on rolling ground, hilly ground where erosion is a big problem, we have a lot more adoption than where we're up in central Indiana where we're on the flat soils that tend to be naturally poorly drained. No-till corn, percentages are much lower, but again, southern Indiana has a lot more adoption because it's almost a no-brainer. If you're going to grow corn in southern Indiana, you better be doing no-till or you're not going to have your field left for very many years, okay? We look at cover crops. Cover crops are much newer for us, but we've had tremendous growth over the last 5 years, and we're up somewhere on the order of about 10% of our crop acreage, as best we can determine. That's cover crops, or 1.1 million acres or so. We're at about 13 million acres of corn and soybeans, so we're up 1.1, 1.2 million acres of cover crops. We lead the Midwest in a cover crop adoption, and again, a lot of that has to do with NRCS having been very, very strong in pushing cover crops. I also want to point out the champions. Sometimes having a champion for no-till or for cover crops makes a big difference. This county right here, Putnam County, that was Barry Fisher, used to be a local NRCS soil conservationist, the county conservationist, not the, anyway, soil conservationist, district conservationist. Now he's at the state and national level. This county up here is Jamie Scott is a farmer who sells cover crop seed and services and who has been a big advocate and very successful with cover crops. Southern Indiana, of course, we have the terrain for it, but sometimes the adoption is really is dependent on a local champion, whether that's a conservation agency person or a farmer, because of the sociology of that. So I'm just dabbling a little bit in some of my observations over the years on the requirements for new practices or systems to be adopted. Certainly it has to have benefits either to the farmer or to society, or preferably both. There has to be some economics to it. For a farmer to adopt it, preferably there would be profit or at least neutral. If they are convinced that something could be beneficial to society, but not necessarily to them, at least needs to be neutral. Preferably the profit would occur over the short term, but many of our practices don't, but over the long term we think they do. Management skills, some people are just simply not able to manage all of the things that go into no-till or cover crop. Simply can't. They don't have the skills, okay? Others just don't do their homework, right? Well, that's their own fault, right? Just like when I don't do my homework, you know, it's my own fault if something doesn't work, right? Well, but you have to convince people that they need to do their homework. A support network is very important, and we really try to get farmers that are new to these things involved with other farmers nearby who have done it, and that works pretty well, not always. And mental attitude and mindset. If I'm convinced that something's not going to work for me in my life, and I'm going to prove it to you that it's not going to work, well, then it won't work, right? It's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. So certainly all of us do that at times, but some people make a habit of that kind of a mindset, and that doesn't help you succeed. So networks and collaborations, I think, are really important both for research and for extension. So researchers, extension staff, and farmers, that was kind of how Shirley started with his no-till work. Whether that work is done at university research centers or on farm. And then extension outreach and education. All the work that I do on extension work in cover crops is with a whole bunch of other people. It's with farmers as part of the training cadre. It's with NRCS. It's with extension staff. It's with other researchers. And that's much more fun as well as being much more effective. Those collaborations might be local, they might be state, they might be multi-state. And I've already talked about local champions being important. Okay, cover crops, no-till or conventional. When we were working on no-till back 20, 30 years ago, we kind of said, at least in Indiana, we basically said, oh man, don't try to do both of those at the same time, okay? Get no-till down, and then maybe try to integrate cover crops. Now, over the last decade or so, we've kind of changed our mind on that. It seems that it actually can help people with the no-till adoption if they also are starting with cover crops, because it jumpstarts the biology a little bit. You get the cover crop roots that are growing and then are alleviating some of that transition time for no-till. So we have a number of farmers that basically start doing both of those things at the same time, and it makes them more successful in that transition. So we have an extension publication at Purdue. I call it our consensus document. This took quite a lot of time and effort to get a number of people in our agronomy department, our weed science folks, and our entomology to kind of agree on something that we could all agree on, that we would suggest to farmers as a beginning point for adopting cover crops. And so the idea with this was to suggest for those just starting a low risk kind of introductory approach to cover crops. And it's also integrating those cover crops into a no-till system. I don't have time to go into the details of that, but basically it's to have a winter kill cover crop before corn and then have your cereal rye before soybeans, doing that all no-till. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that at another time. The other thing, of course, which we've known from the beginning, but somehow doesn't always get translated, is that no-till is a system, not a practice. It's not just stopping tillage. It's looking at the whole system and maybe modifying for fertility, maybe modifying pest management. And sometimes that gets lost in the translation. Folks need to be patient, and on our wet soils, don't get out the first day that your neighbors are getting out. You might have to wait a couple more days, but it's actually better in the no-till system. Adequate drainage. I have worked from southeastern Indiana where we had a drained block and an undrained block, and I had cover crops and I had no-till. And where we had drainage, things worked great. Soil properties improved. Where we didn't have adequate drainage, water ponding, neither the no-till nor the cover crops worked very well. So really adequate drainage, whether it's tile drainage or surface drainage, is really a necessary first component to using some of these other conservation practices. Details, details, details. And again, John Young, the son of Harry Young, in an article in the No-Till Farmer, said that he learned from his dad the importance of paying close attention to those small details. So again, I think we need to reiterate that a lot. All right, so let me move into a couple of things that I see as kind of opportunities and challenges for us in the Midwest. Seeding and stand establishment in the fall in a corn soybean system is still quite challenging because of the timing of harvest and the amount of growing season left. I said we've got growing season, we want to take advantage of it, but it's still kind of short. We have variable fall weather. It's often dry, which means that establishment of your cover crop may be a little risky. Seeding into standing corn and soybean is highly desirable, but it is still pretty variable in the success rate. We have folks that aerially seed, fly it on with an airplane, but getting the timing right is challenging. The amount of the growth in the fall, even if you do get good establishment, is uneven because of the weather and the climate if you look across the region. And the choice of cover crops to have more diversity than just cereal rye. Cereal rye is still kind of the fallback because you can plant it later than just about anything else, but it's a little boring. Really, we want to have some things other than just cereal rye, but a lot of times we just don't have time. We have to get most of those planted by September. Mid-September, better than end of September, but at least sometime in September, and certainly not October. So we need a lot of research for, again, the Corn Belt, where we've got corn soybean systems that are 90+% of our acreage. So seeding practice innovations, a lot of that's going on by farmers as well as researchers working on it. Species and cultivar selection and breeding. When I was talking to the grad students today, there was a couple of them in the kind of the breeding area, and I said, well, how about breeding or selecting some of those cast-offs that aren't any good for your cash crop, or maybe exactly what we want for a cover crop. More roots. I don't care about the grain. I want roots, right? So we need to look at cultivar selection and breeding for cover crops. We'd like to have more growth if we want to achieve some of the benefits that are possible with cover crops. On the other hand, some farmers prefer winter-killed cover crops, especially before corn, because it makes it easier to manage in the spring before corn. So we want more growth, but maybe not too much more growth. And I'll show you a couple of pictures here in a minute. More growth would have more potential benefit for reducing nitrate leaching, could build soil health faster. But if it's too much spring growth, then it makes it difficult to manage. Termination management before corn is an especially difficult challenge for many of our farmers and new researchers. And so again, we want to be careful to try to help with the learning curve on that. So amount of growth. On the left, this is cereal rye at my CPAC site, Southeast Purdue Ag Center. Early April on the left, about 700 pounds per acre. On the right, 2 weeks later, already has tripled in growth, top growth. No root data in this case because it's too hard. It's really interesting, but it's too hard. Please make it easier for me. So we got 2,500 pounds per acre of growth in that couple of weeks. Big difference. The next, a different year, actually last year, we had a very, very, very wet spring. Couldn't get in. This was not our intention to let it head out and get nearly head high. But our cereal rye basically got very tall, and we had a tremendous amount of growth. So we took up lots and lots of nitrogen. We prevented a lot of nitrate leaching. But managing that can be very challenging, especially before corn, and it's not recommended. This year, while I was in Iowa on a sabbatical, they went ahead and planted green, which is, I mean, we did that long time ago. Then we kind of didn't do it, and now people are looking at planting green. That is not a recommended practice. It's not for beginners, especially before corn. In this case, they happen to be planting green soybeans. Good no-till planter, good stand, good growth. But you have a lot of potential risks, especially before corn, with allelopathy, with nitrogen, with armyworm, and so on. So it's not recommended. A number of farmers are doing it and claiming great results. A number of those have been in cover crops for a long time, have tremendous soil health, know how to plant, deal with use starter nitrogen, and deal with all those issues. But that's not what we recommend for beginners. Okay, cover crop mixtures. A lot of interest in cocktail mixes, okay, 10, 12, 14-way mixes. The idea is the more diversity in the plants, the more diversity in the soil biology. But we really don't know how cost-effective those are. So from a research standpoint, it would be really nice to be able to kind of isolate a little bit more what kind of benefit are we getting from all those different kinds of plants. And, is a 3-way mix enough, or a 6-way mix? Do you need a grass, a brassica, and a legume, both a warm season and a cool season? It's usually more costly seed, and you can't really do this successfully unless you get enough growth, and that means usually planting it after wheat. So the picture here is I'm standing out in one of our farmer cooperators' fields. He harvested wheat, applied manure, and then put on a 12-way cocktail mix. Tremendous growth, a lot of diversity, great root structure. So there is some opportunity there. The cover crops do fit a lot more nicely in some systems, like wheat. If you're not in double crop country, which half of Indiana is not really double crop soybean zone. Corn silage we get off early, other short season crops. So a lot of opportunity for those. I find it very intriguing, but I think we need a fair amount of work on that. Okay, let me wrap up with about 3 more kind of slides here. Educational and technical assistance. I do a lot of extension and outreach, and I think that's absolutely key, because again, if we're going to promote practice as being beneficial, we also have to talk about how to make it successful. Most folks need assistance throughout the process, and it doesn't have to be an extension person. It can be a local certified crop advisor, a peer farmer, but they need help in clarifying those goals and selecting the covers and adapting their systems. And we do nobody a service by getting them to adopt cover crops without getting them what they need in order to be successful. Because if they fail miserably the first year, you all know that they will then just say never again. And we still deal with that some places in Indiana with no-till. Never again, because their first year was a terrible disaster because they didn't have any help to get them to really be it successful. Workshops, field days, conferences, train the trainers. There's all kinds of needs there, because again, we need to train our people who are helping the farmers, because many of them don't know how to do it either. Most of us learned somewhere along the way, right? Sometimes the hard way, and sometimes because somebody who was really good at it showed us. So we need to help folks with all of that transition. I do think we need better numbers on short and long-term economics. This is kind of the holy grail. We've been working with some economists, but it's still very difficult to get those numbers. Education of landowners and land managers is something that we've been starting to do. We actually have some of our better farmers who have landowners who come to them now and say, please farm my land and I will reduce the cash rent by whatever it is, because I want you to use cover crops, okay? So that's a great position to be in when we get to that kind of a thing. And there are business opportunities with cover crops. We have a couple of our co-ops that not just sell the seed, but they sell the seeding, they sell the termination, they work with the farmer so that they understand how to make that work and how to be successful. All right, couple summary key points. Cover crops can be a very important component, I think, of soil health and water quality. But the details are extremely important on which cover crop and how do you properly manage it. We need a lot of research and development in the Midwest, and we need a lot of education and technical assistance. And I think true partnerships where we have all the conservation agencies and the universities and the agribusiness working together are really key. So with that, my last slide is the Midwest Cover Crops Council, which you're just one state south of the Midwest Cover Crops Council. So there's some good information in here that can be useful in Kentucky. We updated our website about a year ago, and we have a pocket guide that's a very popular pocket guide for farmers, and we're working on a phone app of that right now. So with that, I don't know if we have time for questions, but thank you very much for your attention.
So we do have time for questions. I'm going to see if I can remember how to turn the microphones on the audience. Okay, questions?
Yes.
So in the soils that have low bioavailable nutrients or like macronutrients, have there been a work out there to where metal hyperaccumulators have been used to scavenge these nutrients and make them bioavailable for the plants?
Where metal
Hyperaccumulators?
I'm not aware of work where the metal hyperaccumulators have been tested to see about their nutrient accumulation. There may be, but I'm not aware of that. I know that nutrient cycling in general with cover crops is an area that a lot of people are looking at, but whether they've looked at that particular angle or not, I'm not aware of that. That's an interesting question.
Eileen, if you've only got 50 years, 40% adoption of no-till, cover crops is only at 10%. It's going to be the mid-22nd century before there's really effective use of cover crops in agricultural systems. Or do you see that accelerating?
Am I supposed to repeat the question for the?
I hope the mics work, but if you in the habit of repeating the questions, that's great.
Okay, well, so we only have 40% adoption of no-till in 50 years, and we got 10% adoption of cover crops in 5 years, Mark. So cover crops is an exponential increase. So we are anticipating, we are working very hard to promote, and we are anticipating a much more rapid adoption of cover crops. That remains to be seen. Cover crops is such a hot topic right now. I mean, there are conferences, farmer conferences, field days all over the place. What I'm hoping, of course, is that there can be enough benefit to those farmers who are trying it that it's not just a flash in the pan, that it kind of keeps going. Time will tell, of course, but our Midwest Cover Crops Council goal is to have 30% coverage by, actually, I think it was by 2020, but now we're going to go for 2025. 30% coverage in the Midwest. And the national, NRCS and the Soil Health Initiative and all kinds of other things are really trying to aim for very large adoption. I think there's a chance, and it does seem to be going more rapidly than the no-till adoption, in part because of the water quality impetus, because cover crops are very effective in reducing the nitrate leaching. So whether that ends up being cost share or regulatory or just the time is right that we deal with the nutrient issue, and cover crops are a win-win way to do that. They still have challenges, but it's a win-win way of improving the soil as well as reducing the nutrient leaching. So I'm hopeful that we will advance this much faster. Yes.
In a no-till system, dissolved phosphorus release quite a bit. Dissolved phosphorus is one of the problem in no-till system that impact on water quality. Right? So having cover crop in no-till system, how does it helps to reduce the phosphorus, dissolved phosphorus release from the
Right. So dissolved phosphorus is much more tricky answer, of course, than is sediment phosphorus, right? If you have cover crop and you have no-till, you reduce the sediment loss tremendously, okay? So the dissolved phosphorus, I would say the jury is out on that, because part of the concern is with when the cover crop dies, whether it freezes in the winter, winter kill, or whether it's sprayed, that you can release phosphorus from the cover crop, just like you release from any other, just like any plant that dies is going to release some phosphorus. So
degradation of organic matter release.
yeah, it would be the degradation of the cover crop itself, or in some cases it's the freezing, bursting of the cell wall and releasing it. So it's not even a degradation; it's just a very quick release from the cell wall. So I don't think that we have a consistent picture on that yet. We have a lot of hype about it, and cover crops contributing soluble phosphorus as they die, especially as they freeze. I saw a recent paper that was talking more about the level of how harsh is the freezing, because that by itself can have a different effect on how much is released. If it's a moderate freeze like we tend to get, there's much less released than, and in this one paper I was looking at, basically they couldn't distinguish between what was released versus what was released from the soil. But if it's a minus 20 degrees, then it releases a lot. So I don't think we have an answer to that one yet. Aaron.
So what tilts the balance for northern Indiana, Illinois towards no-till?
Well, right now it's not. No-till is in southern Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio.
Sorry, let me rephrase that. What will or what can help farmers in northern Indiana and Illinois adopt no-till sooner?
Right. It's not a scientific question, because our scientific data already has shown that it's just as good as conventional tillage. Part of what so there's a lot of those other factors, the sociological factors. If you have a local champion, sometimes that helps. If you have a change in you have to buy different machinery for no-till to work. So if somebody is got old machinery and just keeps making that old machinery work, then it is an investment to get the machinery that's necessary in order for no-till to work. The details and paying attention to those details is really important. So how do you get somebody to pay enough attention to the details to go to a workshop where they learn how to adjust their planter and how to get the right attachments? There are workshops like that all the time, but somebody has to want to go and do that. How do you get somebody who doesn't want to do that or thinks they're doing good enough? And that's part of the issue. That's why I think cover crops are a little bit easier sell, because as several people have described to me, the agency people and farmers, there's something to a farmer. Farmers like to grow things, right? And so growing things is what they do, and a cover crop is another thing to grow. And there's something about a green landscape at this time of year when it's pretty well. Kentucky, you got green all the time, but in Indiana we got a lot of brown, right? So having something green when it's normally brown, I think, is very attractive. And so I think that is a little bit psychologically easier sell than no-till. But if they can do them together, then maybe that would be one way to get more no-till. And if the cover crops can help ease the way into no-till. Part of the problem is cold, wet. You know, and I have a former graduate student who's now up in Wisconsin. He does dealing with the same thing. It's too cold and wet up here to do no-till. He's doing it successfully, right? So there's the attitude of, is it too cold and wet? Well, no, but it's more of a challenge. So I don't have the answer to it. I mean, I wish I did, because I'd like to see a lot more adoption. John?
One of the strategies, in fact, Erin's exploring it, some of her work, is to grow a little bit shorter maturity, full season corn, shorter maturity, full season soybean, in order to get that cover crop established a little earlier, get a little better growth on it.
Yep.
Without regard to experimental data, has there been, in your mind, enough modeling of this, of the consequences of this? In other words, do we really understand whether there's much yield sacrifice or anything on these full season cash crops when we shorten up their maturity so that we can get them harvested earlier? Or is that still another one of those unexplored opportunities?
I think it's the latter. I don't think there's been modeling in this context to say how much would I lose